hi ho, hi hi ho. Hey ho, hi ho ho, hi ho ho, hi ho ho, hi ho hi ho, hi ho 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 ho. Bush lady, come to the city. Hey ho, hi ho ho, hi ho ho, hi ho hi hi ho, hi ho ho, hi ho hi hi ho. City.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Levine, and welcome to the Gould Standard, a podcast brought to you by the Glenn Gould Foundation. We bring you conversations with some of the most remarkable people from all across the world of the arts. If film, music, poetry, visual art, theater, novels, or dance are the form of truth-telling that you turn to for enlightenment and hope, I think you're in for a treat, because we're going to be speaking with one of the most powerful and courageous truth-tellers I know. But first, while you're stopping by under our glowing neon piano sign, please do take a moment to press like, share, and subscribe. And if you happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, please kindly leave your reviews, pose your questions, and be part of our community of friends and supporters. And to get more illuminating words, images, and sounds, we'd love you to pay us a visit at our website, glenngould.ca. And while you're stopping by there, you will not fail to notice a donate button. We are a registered Canadian charity, and we really do rely on the support of generous people like you. Please give generously to help us continue our work. Now, on to today's guest. I'll tell you a little story. Last October, the Glenn Gould Foundation convened an international jury of 13 major artists to choose the next laureate of the Glenn Gould Prize. These artists represented a wide range of creative disciplines, from music to literature, performance art, and architecture and design, as well as diverse cultures and backgrounds. They were spread out in these COVID times, from California to Chennai, India. Under the superb leadership of our chair, the great Laurie Anderson, they discussed, deliberated, and debated a dazzling array of artists who had been nominated for the prize by you, the arts-loving public. Many of these were big stars, so to speak, household names of fame and glamour, but one name kept coming to the fore in our discussions. While several of the jurors confessed that they had been unfamiliar with her and her work going in, they had read about her, taken the time to watch and listen to her work, and by the time they were done, they were convinced that she perfectly epitomized the ideals of the prize, a creator of a body of work that has enriched the human condition through the arts. And so, with both pride and humility, our jurors chose Alanis Obomsawin as the 13th Glenn Gould Prize laureate. Alanis has been called the mother of Indigenous cinema, and that is true. When she began with Canada's National Film Board in the 1960s, an Indigenous woman had never directed one of their films before. Over the next 50 years, she has directed more than 50 documentary films, fearlessly shedding light and honesty on the uncomfortable facts and the inglorious past and present of Canada in its treatment of the First Nations of this beautiful land. Of course, the truths she tells are equally applicable to the experience of Indigenous people the world over. Alanis, drawing on her rich Abenaki heritage, is a storyteller to her core, whether through her films, her beautiful etchings and prints, her music, and her work as a teacher. Jessie Wente, who now chairs the Canada Council for the Arts, has said, her whole career is an act of decolonization of our screens, of our institutions, but most importantly, a decolonization of our thoughts and how we think and see the world. And I think that has completely shaped and influenced how the country actually moved forward since then. I honestly can't imagine us getting a Truth and Reconciliation Commission without the work of Alanis Obomsawin. She's that foundational and important to Canadian culture. It has been such a privilege and joy for us all at the Glenn Gould Foundation over these past months to spend time with Alanis a woman who has lived the hardships and injustices suffered by her people, explored that pain and projected it into our hearts and minds, and yet has maintained a great spirit of love, hopefulness, and openness to a new time of compassion, justice, and respect for human dignity that we all need to work together to bring about. Alanis, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This sounds great.
Well, you are great. I'm really glad that you were able to take time to chat with us. I'd like to start by speaking a little bit with you about your early life, first because it really was remarkable, but also it seems to have influenced many aspects of your career and your work. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were born and how you grew up and the family that you spent time with in your community?
I was born in Lebanon, New Hampshire, because my mother was working there at the time. And at the age of 6 months, she took me to Odanak, the community where she was born and where my father was born. I remained there. She went back to the States, and I stayed there with her sister, my aunt, Jessie, and my uncle and their children, and they took care of me. I was 6 months old at the time. Apparently, I became very ill, and I was in coma for a period of time, and the doctor from next door had said that they should watch me. I should be dying the next few hours that night. But an old aunt of my mother came in, and she wrapped me up in a blanket, and she took me to her place on the reserve. And she kept me for 6 months, and nobody knows what she did, but she saved my life, and I'm here.
Oh, that's amazing. And so during that time, first of all, good fortune to you and to us that you survived. And I'm assuming that the healing methods that she used were traditional methods that saved your life.
Nobody knows, but probably because she was known as a healer, and she had married my grandmother's brother, whose name was Pierre Nagajwa. And the name of the woman, my mother's aunt, was Marie-Jeanne Parquet. But she was known to heal people around the village. And she made that decision to take me away. It's incredible.
Against the doctor's orders. So that took
Yes.
some courage and determination. So Odanak, when you were growing up with your aunt and your uncle, and they had 6 children of their own, right?
Yes, but the 3 of them were already gone. They were adults, and there was 3 at home. The daughter was my age, and a younger son and an older son.
Now, Odanak, which is one of the largest remaining Abenaki communities, it's on the south shore of the St. Lawrence, and it has a long history, but the Abenaki people were really spread throughout New England and parts of what we now think of as Eastern Canada before contact. What was the community like when you were growing up in it?
Actually, it was very small. In terms of territory, as declared as a reserve, it's about 1 mile by 4 miles. In those days, there was just an earth road, and everything was happening on that road. To just give you some fun example, my Aunt Jessie would say, "Lock the door, the anthropologist is coming." Because the ethnologists and the anthropologists came time and time again, and they asked million questions, and it was difficult for some people to agree to it. But at the same time, there were people at home who were storytellers and would spend times with these people who were professional anthropologists.
And I understand that one of the leading ways that people made a living, aside from hunting and also guiding, which I'd like to talk about, but also basket making. And in one of your films, I've seen the most beautiful, extraordinary baskets that were made by the people in Odanak.
For many generations, our people have done that as a business and have built a village and have been able to survive. In the summer, the village would be empty because everybody was going to the States, to New England, where was our territory. And they would open like movable stores, and they would make baskets. And some of them, like my grandparents, had a house in a place called Ottawa Beach. And there, they would have a sign that says, "We, the Abenaki, are here." They would make baskets on demand. So people could come and say, "I want a basket to fit the corner. I want it round. I want it this color, so high." And they would do exactly what they asked for.
Wow.
It was so smart. The baskets was made of ash and sweetgrass. And sometimes the splint of the ash was dyed in different colors, beautiful colors. It was hard work. Like, we would work long hours. And then at one point, the United States government wanted to start taxing our people going back and forth and wanting them to pay taxes on whatever they sold. So people started stopping to go to the States. So they were working in Canada, and then the government of Canada took over this business. They had a little store on the reserve, and they start paying people very poorly. And then the value of the basket went down. It was just terrible. So then people stopped teaching their children to make baskets because they felt they're going to be working all their lives for free for nothing. But we still have some people who do make baskets.
It's really extraordinary. I mean, if you look at it, and I saw in your film about how the territory of Odanak, which had basically been carved out from one of the old feudal seigneuries, then became smaller and smaller and smaller. You know, it's the same old story with Indigenous people. We put you in this box, and then we make the box smaller because we're taking more and more of the territory. That must have been very hard. Also in New England, the people in New England, I know, suffered greatly and have even had to struggle simply to be recognized as an Indigenous people up until very recently.
There's still a lot of them that are not recognized. Quebec is different in Canada than all the other provinces, because in Quebec, it was the French that came here first. And the French had a certain way of talking, and so a certain way of being and believing too. They never made any treaties with our people in this province. They felt it was their country. That's why they call it New France. And that they had conquered us and it was their country. So that alone was very difficult, and we were under the law of the Napoleon Law. So this is the only place in Canada that there were the system of seigneuries. The King of France would give a title to an individual and would give him a land, which was on land, so much acres of land, and he became like a seigneur of that territory and had a lot of people working for him. You can imagine what that was like. It's a very different system than all the rest of the country.
And I also read, and I was actually horrified to read, that in Vermont in the 1930s through 1950s, they actually had a statewide eugenics program. And one of the targets for that program for involuntary sterilization were Abenaki people. And they think that perhaps thousands of Abenaki over those 30 years or so were sterilized. It's horrifying.
And many of them, they didn't even know it. You know, if they went to the hospital for anything, they would sterilize them because they had them right there.
Horrible. It's horrible. To something a little bit perhaps less horrible, what are your memories of Odanak growing up? What were the people like, the kinds of environment? I understand that it was quite poor. You didn't have electricity. But, you know, what are your memories of those times and your family and friends?
There was no electricity and there was no running water. We had a well, we had oil lamps, and at night the atmosphere was like sat in the kitchen and adults told stories. In our case, in Odanak, a lot of the men that had gone to be guides in the fall had lots of stories about animals, behavior, and people they were guiding, what they were like. And so if you had 4 or 5 children listening to this, you had 4 or 5 different stories because we had no images. It was just the sound, the voice of people. And you imagine in your head you make images. So it's different. It's like, I think this is the reason why I make films the way I do, because I always do just sound first. I love to hear.
Hmm.
And for me, listening is it's a word. It's the most important thing.
Right.
And coming back to that time, if you had 5 kids listening to a story and you hear it, but you got no image, so you imagine. So yeah, 5 different films right there, because
Mhm.
each child imagines something totally different than the other. So I never forgot that. And for me, it's very sacred. I love to listen, especially when I'm working with older people, to hear what it was like and to imagine that they have survived. And it's their own country, and it was so unfriendly for a long time. And it's so rich in the way that people tell their story and how they did it, how they cultivate the land, how they cultivate their own mind to have a good life with what's possible, and taking from the heart and the mind and creating a special world.
And in addition to stories, was music and singing songs of your people a part of your memories as well?
Lots of singing and lots of dancing and drumming that was always very close to the people, and making song about the everyday life.
You mentioned guiding, and I understand that being guides for wealthy people who came to Quebec because they had hunting lodges was also one of the ways that people made a living. Can you tell us a bit about what that was like?
Yeah, it was very different at that time. In this province, there were lakes were privately owned very often. For instance, there was a lake here in the north. There was a lake called Lac La Pêche. This was privately owned. It means that they had members. In our case, I think about 35 members were from the States and 35 from Canada. And obviously, all these people who belonged there as a member were rich people, people who could afford it. And they would arrive there in helicopters or small planes, and they would hire a lot of Abenakis to go guiding for hunting and fishing. A guide's work was not only to just take them to find the animals, but also to put up the tent, to serve these people or this family everything, making food. And there's lots of stories that were told to us of happenings in those times. And then when the separatist government came into power in Quebec, they banished that, finished, there's no more private lake. It was for everybody. And so the whole thing changed.
You had members of your family. For example, you had an uncle Theo, Theophile Hanadis, right? Who was a guide.
He was a guide. He was my mother's cousin. He taught me a lot of songs and told me a lot of stories. And he was an incredible storyteller and had a lot of knowledge about everything concerning the Abenaki people.
I mean, he is someone that a lot of historians turned to back in that period to document
Yes.
the history of your people. Can you remember any stories? For example, one, again, getting back to things that aren't so pleasant, about Major Rogers' raid. Was that one of the stories he would tell you?
Not at that time. I learned about Rogers Raid a little bit later on, but he knew all that story. I wrote a story about Rogers coming to Odana. It's in French. Because Major Roger wrote about it himself and said that he had killed about 200 people. But some people were arguing in terms of the number and arguing in terms of the story. Because when he came in the middle of the night to burn the village and shoot people and destroy the village completely, he had guides that took him to Udanak. And one of them, who was an indigenous person, came in the dark. It was at night. And that particular night, the people were celebrating, and they were in kind of a longhouse dancing and singing. And sometimes some of them would come out just to cool because it was so hot in there. And this young woman was outside, and somebody whispered to her and said, "Don't be afraid, I've come to warn you. This is our story." And he told her that someone during the night was going to come and burn their village down and kill everybody, and she should go and warn the old people, the man, to help themselves. And then he took off. So she ran inside this dancing place, told people, but a lot of people didn't think that it was true. But some of them were worried, and they went to hide with their family in a place in Odanai. So all those people who went to hide were survivors. And then there were others that did not get killed but were taken as prisoners with Major Roger. And then he had so many problems when he was traveling back to Vermont, because our people, and many of them had gone to Quebec City to fight on the side of Montcalm, which was the French leader. Wolfe was the one for the English, and there was a big battle on the plains of Abraham, 1759. The English won. So it changes how Quebec would be ruled after. I never found out if it was a coincidence or if it was planned that way, but not many days after the battle, that's when Major Roger came with his men to destroy the village. I still don't know. I've done some research on that. That I think might have been a coincidence that these dates were chosen.
But it's obviously the kind of traumatic event. It was only by the good luck of having that warning that some of the people were able to survive, that Odanak continued as a community, and the story is kept alive among the people. So your childhood took a bit of a dramatic change when you were, I think, was it 7 years old that you went to live in Trois-Rivières?
I'm not sure if it's 7 or 8 or 6. It's hard to tell for me because that's when I left Odanak to go and live somewhere else. But every summer I all spent in Odanak after all the vacation time and Christmas time. I would be in Odanak, so I have a hard time to know exactly when I moved out to live someplace else. That's when I found out that I was poor.
And were reminded that there were differences in Quebec society and in Canadian society between Indigenous people and the white people. You've described that as a very hard time for you. You were in a class, there were nuns teaching you. It must have been very difficult. You were the only Indigenous child, right?
Yes, and especially when she would open the book of the history of Canada, I knew I was going to get beat up that day, because in those books that were written by the church, actually, were teaching how the savages were. We were ignorant. We didn't have religion. We were scalping the poor whites that came here, and all this kind of stories in those books. So you can imagine the way they looked at me. As I grew a little bit older, I began to realize there was something really wrong, very wrong, that were with the license teaching children to hate. And I thought, what could I do? The children have to hear another story. That's how I started getting very involved. Eventually, I did a lot of touring, a lot of schools in the country. That's the best decision I made in my life. For the children to hear something else than what they were reading was very important.
Absolutely. But it must also have been very lonely for you. I mean, first of all, being bullied and beaten up. I mean, this happened more than once. It must have happened quite a few times.
Yeah.
But at some point you decided that you weren't going to take it anymore, right?
Yeah. It's a difficult time to talk about.
Well, I don't want to linger on it, but it seems as though you made a decision that this had to stop, and you put your foot down and you stopped it, being beaten up.
Yes. I had a whole scenario. I knew I was going to do that.
I'm glad you did. So you got through school and you got through your teen years, and obviously there are always challenges to be a teenager and, growing up, and suddenly boys who were behaving one way behaved quite a different way, and that must have been confusing and difficult as well.
Today I'm sure of it, but in those days it was like a big puzzle. I realized how education is important for all people, but also very dangerous. If you're going to school and you're learning to hate and you're learning to be controlling other people, it's very bad. And when you're very young, what do you know? If this is what they're teaching you, you grow up hating some people, certain race, with all kinds of ideas that you hear at that time. And that's my very simple way of understanding what was going on at that time. This is how I made big move.
But also, before you were finished your teens, you had begun modeling. And that must have been a big change. Suddenly you're appearing in fancy clothes and, being photographed and being treated essentially like the center of attention instead of the girl hiding at the back of the class. Was that a positive experience for you?
It was incredible. I was 16 when I was first asked to model in a fashion show, high fashion show. There was this one woman who had a haute couture place where she was designing clothes, and she was brilliant. For some reason, she felt that I should model. Wasn't my idea. She would give me clothes at the time, a dress that could sell for $300 for a dress. It's like $3,000 today.
Mm-hmm.
They were so beautiful. I could never in my life buy a dress like that. But she would give me one, and just because I was wearing it, she said that people wanted it or went to her. Her name was Pauline Duval, and she was brilliant. It was really high-class stuff. And then there was another one whose name was Clairette, and she had a store, and she used to sell material, and she started doing fashion. It was a total different grade of clothes, but it was wonderful. So I was modeling for the two, and I learned. Pauline used to take me to Montreal with her to go when she was going to these stores that don't exist, not store, that like factory. It was called France Couture. All material came from France, and they were the top-notch material. And that's where I learned the different kind of material. I learned so many things with her about how you dress. Why is this material better than the other? What's the name of it? Yeah, some wrinkles, some don't. And all that stuff I learned when I was 16. Wow. And I was fascinated by it. I just loved it. Yeah.
So it was a good experience, but it also led to you spending some time in the United States. I understand that you ended up moving for a while to model in Florida.
I was modeling bathing suits. And I couldn't speak English at all. And I realized that this was dangerous. So I got a job taking care of children. And so I had a house where I was staying at. Had to mind the children every night because they went out a lot. And sleep there. So I felt protected. And they would lend me a car to go and model downtown. These lines, I remember one line was Catalina bathing suit. I would model all day, then go back in the car that they had lent me, and then stay with the children. And that's where I learned English, with the children. I picked the worst thing in the world. I was reading the Indian Act. Previously to that, I used to read it in French. So I could fight in French, but I couldn't fight in English. So I had the Indian Act, English and French. And it was awful because you read a paragraph and then it would say, or you go to another page, another paragraph, because there's a change here. But that's how I learned English with the Indian Act and the children.
Good training. You could probably write contracts because it's written in that kind of language. So,
oh my God!
But that's really fascinating. And one thing that strikes me about that, this is, I'm guessing 52 or 53, something like that, maybe. But there are you, and it's Florida. So you're really in the middle of the Jim Crow South, where there's this horrendous oppression of Black people. And you're not exactly fair-skinned and blue-eyed and blonde. It's really
not
interesting.
Exactly, no.
No. But isn't it interesting that you were presented in a fashion beauty context at a time where dark-skinned people were so completely discriminated against. Very, very hard to understand.
Yeah.
But anyway, you came back to Canada, and this time you came to Montreal, right?
I didn't come directly here. I went back to Three Rivers and then I moved here.
And it was a very special time in the history of Quebec and Montreal. You'd grown up under the government of Premier Maurice Duplessis, which was definitely a very, very conservative time. But everything was opening up in the 1950s, and Montreal became a really exciting place for culture, for the arts, for intellectual life, with people like, well, actually, two of your fellow Glenn Gould Prize laureates, Oscar Peterson and Leonard Cohen, were, starting their careers then, but lots of other people too, Irving Layton and Riopelle, and you were in the middle of that. And you were actually moving in a circle of artists and intellectuals too at that time.
Yes, I was. And I must say that the language was very new to me in terms of, I had never been surrounded by people who keep giving you compliments. I was never used to that. Things like, I won't repeat it, it's embarrassing, but you're always making compliments on what you look like and all sorts of things. So I felt very loved in a lot of ways. I don't mean lovers and things like that. I mean, by a lot of wonderful people, mainly artists.
And was it around this time that you also started singing in their circle and finding that part of your voice again?
That's before. I was singing only like in schools, places like that before that, for teaching and showing games to children, playing with children. Sometimes I'd have a large group, like several classes, but sometimes it was one class, and I would do one class at a time. And then recreation time, I would run into the field with the children and show them Indian games. I don't regret 1 minute of it. It was really special for me. And I did hundreds of schools, including at the time in the 60s, residential schools. I did quite a few residential schools at that time.
It must have been very striking that knowing you and the way you present yourself and represent the culture, you are presenting such a different image of an Indigenous woman compared to what you had been exposed to in those textbooks. A proud person with a rich culture, with stories, and also you'd come out of fashion modeling, so presented very attractively and so on. This must have felt like you were teaching a lesson to them just by the way you presented yourself in the class.
I don't think I was thinking of myself like that. My main reason was to show how beautiful our people are, how cultivated they are in a different way, and what the values are. It was to show the best side of our people, which is there and still there today. And those were the reasons. I didn't want this thing to continue about the battles and the scalping and what savages we were. We were ignorant. We didn't have religion. And all that stuff which is vicious and untrue. That was the reason.
But you defied the stereotypes that they were getting in those books by basically showing the richness of the culture, and all the things that they read about were clearly not true based on what you showed them. And, this is actually kind of ironic because all during this period, Indigenous people in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, didn't yet have the right to vote.
It started in 1960, but there's another story that I learned lately from Senator St. Clair, who tells a story in a little film that I just finished. He taught me something. The way for us to become citizens of Canada only happened in 1960. So when you think of it, they still have all the residential schools, all the same system. So 1960, from what I learned, there were big changes all over the world for a lot of people, including Canada, including Indigenous people. And previously, this 1960, we weren't allowed, many things were against the law. And for instance, to have celebration, to have ceremonies, to have powwows. We couldn't do that. You should have seen us. We were like children of 1960s, just doing it everywhere. So you could travel all summer long and go to a powwow every week. Somewhere there was one. And it was really quite special. But Senator Sinclair really teaches us in this film that I just finished, which is called Honor to Senator Sinclair, to Senator Mary Sinclair. And he tells a story that is so important. He says in 1885, Sir Macdonald, who was the Prime Minister of Canada and also the Minister of Indian Affairs, he had these two roles, decided, he said, well, if we want these Indian people to be civilized, we should give them the right to vote. So they gave the right to vote if you were over 18 and if you were a man, because women were more allowed to vote, and if you owned property. And this went on, and it didn't take long for our people to outvote some minister that they didn't like. So Macdonald was furious. So he made a new rule in the Indian Act that I've been studied all my life. Paragraph tells you what the rule is, what the law is. If there's a change, you go to this place, you find the change. So he had a paragraph that said a person, the word person, is anybody in the world except Indians. So if you were not a person, you couldn't vote. This is how he took away the right to vote at that time in 1891. And then all this time after, not allowed to vote until 1960, what I was talking about.
Well, it seems that it's almost like an echo from the past, because we see in certain parts of the world politicians or political parties that don't like the way some of the people vote, try to keep them from being able to vote. That's, it's an old story that we should put an end to once and for all.
Yeah.
So you were singing in schools, and I assume that you would maybe sing at parties and in small gatherings, but eventually you end up on a stage in New York at Town Hall in 1960. By the way, that's the place where Glenn Gould made his concert debut in the States 5 years earlier.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
In New York?
Yeah, in New York at Town Hall. And he was also born the same year as you, so you have those things in common. But how did that come about? Because it didn't sound like you were, singing with the idea of having a concert career, but suddenly you're on a stage in New York.
I just about died. That's because I used to sing at parties. And this man who was working for Folkways was there and preparing a Canadian concert in New York. And there were 7 or 8 of us, and asked me. At first I said, oh no. After a period of time, said, oh, you might enjoy it and it's important. So I said yes. After I said yes, I was sorry I said yes. So anyway, I end up in New York, and there was an entertainer man that I just love, and his name was Tijan Carignan. And he was very famous as a violin. He even went to play for the Queen. And he traveled with me and my mother. I took my mother. By the time we got on the stage, my mother told me, I was so scared, the place was packed and you don't see people. The light is just where you are. You don't see the people. And my mother said, I don't remember that, but she said I was pulling on my hand like this, not saying a word. And a woman who was sitting next to my mother, who was the wife of this guy who had asked me to go and sing, she says, I thought your mother was going to faint. Because, at a stage like that, a minute is like an hour. It's just terrible. And I was standing there so afraid. I said, well, I wish I could just drop dead. I wouldn't have to sing. That's what I was thinking. Finally, there's no sound at all. And I just said, I'm having a hard time. Still no sound at all. Then I started to sing. And then I guess it was okay, But my God, I said, never again. I'm going on the stage. Oh, it was just so scary.
Well, obviously they liked you enough that you got invited to do a lot more performing, and you ended up singing across the country. You mentioned in schools and in Indigenous communities and also in prisons and at folk festivals.
You want to hear a funny story?
I always want to hear a funny
The
story.
funniest, one time, somebody said to me, oh, I think it was 1968. He said, did you know that in prison, the majority of prisoners are, they didn't say Indigenous in those days. He said,
Right.
are Indian. So I said, oh, yeah. I didn't know that. He said, oh, yeah, it's a known fact. It's everywhere. I said, well, it means my family's in jail. I'm going to go and see them. So I met this man who had been in jail, but was a professional doctor. I forget of what. He wanted to help prisoners. And I don't know how come somebody introduced me to him. And I told him that I want to go and sing in jail. He said, I'll fix it for you. And he arranged for me to go and sing in several prisons. But there's one of them, a maximum prison. It's very severe. And so it was arranged that I would go and sing there. And they said, this is the toughest one. He said, people who come to this jail, often it's because they come from another province, from another prison. They're called, I don't know what to say the name, people who tell on other prisoners.
Right.
And so they get into fights, and then they move from one place to the next, and they end up here in Quebec in this prison. And they're telling me how awful it is, and and don't ask me, I just wasn't afraid. But I was hearing all this, and they said, oh, it's very dangerous, and all this stuff. So they said, there's 500 prisoners here. So my main concern was, I was worried that I might look sexy. So I put on a nun's apron. It's like a dress made of cotton, and it's little stripe with big puff sleeves. It's what they wear for cleaning the floor and stuff like that. And it's loose. So I was sure I didn't tempt anybody. So I arrived there. I forget the time. Let's say I was allowed to stay an hour or two. That's at 2:00, supposed to start. So I come at 1:30. I don't know if this is the right time. I'm just using any time.
Right.
And there were some guards there, and they said, oh, Madame Obamsawin, I don't know if you're going to have anybody to come and see you, because, they're all telling each other, nobody's ever come there to entertain before. And so I said, that's okay. If I'm allowed to stay for this period, I'll stay. If nobody comes, there's no big deal. I'll just go back home. And let's say it's 1:30, nobody. 20 to 2, nobody. And he keep saying, he said, oh, I hope you don't feel. I said, look, I don't care. I just came and it's all right, So let's say maybe 1:45. 500 guys gets in the place. And I think the floor must have been cement, because they had these chairs made of iron, and it's very noisy when you move them.
Yeah.
And the noise was terrible, and they all sit there. So now I'm taken to the front, and at the front, you have all these guys sitting there. It's a flat floor. There's a table, and at the table, there's a microphone on a stand here, and the other side of the table, I'm supposed to sing from here. I said, are you crazy? I don't see anybody. So I take a chair, I put it on the table, one of those chairs. I get another chair, I jump on that chair, and then on the table and on the chair. Now I'm sitting on the chair, on the table, so I can see everybody. So you can imagine what I must have looked like in my nun's dress and my drum. And so I'm sitting there, and I start talking to the prisoners, and then I start singing a song with my drum. And there was 2 guys at the front, 2 Quebecers on the front row. They start laughing at me. They were laughing from the heart. It's so funny, like their shoulders was going like this, they're killing themselves laughing. And me, I'm having a hard time to finish my song because I keep looking at them. So finally, I finished my song. And I said, if you think that this is funny, you're going to take my place. Come and sing, and I'll go and sit at your place. We'll see how funny it is. And then with no word, I could feel in the room. Then I got scared. I said, they're going to get beat up. Because I said, if you think it's funny, these 2 guys are laughing at me.
Right.
And then I said, no, I take care of myself. I didn't want anybody to be against it. So finally, I said, I'll sing again. We'll see, sing another song. And they were laughing, but not so much. And then I start teaching them words in my language, and we're singing. The whole place is singing with me. And finally, one of the guards comes and he says, okay, you guys, you got to go back to your cells. And she has to leave. And not one guy went out without coming to touch me, my hand, or kiss me on the cheek and saying thank you, including these two guys who was laughing so much. And he said, sorry. I said, look, I think I must have looked so funny. I probably would have done the same if I'd been sitting at your place, looking at me, looking like this. So I never forgot that experience. Oh my God, it was unbelievable.
That's great. And of course, you were ahead of the curve with people later like Johnny Cash performing in Folsom Prison, and you were really leading the way for them.
I would never compare myself with them, but Johnny Cash, oh my God.
Yeah.
He would have killed himself laughing or watching me. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh.
So this is now the 1960s. It's, of course, the height of the folk song movement. There's the protest movement. There's so many areas of social awareness throughout North America that are being elevated through traditional music and new folk songs. And you were part of that. You were at the Mariposa Festival during its heyday, and you could have continued building that presence in music. But suddenly in the 1960s, your career took a very different turn with your introduction to the National Film Board. And can you tell us a little bit about how that came about? You're on one path, and the next moment, you're on a very different path.
I forget why or how, but I was invited to go to the film board to do like a talk. And they had me, in those days, they had small theaters that people looked at the stock shot arriving, and it was very small. Perhaps you could have 30 people in there, nothing more than that. And they sat me there and they said, tell us a story like you do in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't, it was easy for me to do, which I did. They were all producers and directors there. And it was nice. It started like that. And then I was asked to be a consultant on film that they were doing out west. And I said yes. Of course, I didn't know what I was getting into. And I immediately saw that this was wrong, because I realized they were using me to come under reserve and have access in film. And as I start to be afraid, I thought, oh my God, if they don't like the film, they'll say it's Alanis's fault. She brought them here. I saw that immediately. And I was right. And I said to the people at the board, don't you ever, ever ask me to be a consultant like that on anything. I'm not interested. I don't want to be part of it. There was a studio called Multimedia at the time, and everything they did in there was for the classroom. So when I learned that, I was very excited. And what they were doing there, all the programs were done what they call film strips, which is like a strip of a 35 millimeter celluloid. You pick up your story with images, like it could be photographs or slides, and you number them, and you know what your story is going to be. So, and then you take it to the animation camera, and they would shoot it in one strip, and this is why it was called film strip.
Right.
But it had no sound. So they had these small projectors in each classroom that this strip could go through. Then in another part of the room, they had a long playing record. And you had a long playing record where the sound was. And when let's say the sound says, there were 12 chiefs here. So the teacher would tell the child who's sitting next to the projector, move the projector, so that she would move the projector, each phrase by hand. And it took me a long time to do the first educational kit. By the time I was finished, this had progressed a little bit. So by the time I got to the classroom, the same system, the same projector, and the record player over here, but it had what's more advanced, it would say, there were 12 chiefs here, boing! And the boing would make the frame change. And so you heard the boing after each phrase, and I thought, oh my God, when I go back to the reserve and showing this to people, look at all that point, But it turned out to be fantastic because it was in all the classroom and I had more fun with that. And it was just fantastic. And that was the first time we had a professional product that was in the classroom, part of the educational system, very different than what they were used to here. And that's how I started. And I would always work in 3 languages: language of the people. And in the case of Manoan, it was Atigamekw or Cree. And, it would take a long time. And also I was learning at the same time. I couldn't do these things overnight, but they were fantastic. Back in the classroom, it was really something.
And it's I think very hard for people today to remember what a powerful relationship the NFB had with the school systems all across this country. I remember very well the presentation of film strips with the film strip projector with a manual crank to advance the frames forward. And every 2 weeks or a month, the teacher would roll in from an AV department, which was basically a closet with a couple of 16 millimeter projectors, Bell and Howell projectors, and we'd watch an NFB film.
Yeah.
So it was really like an automatic audience all across the country.
Yeah, I enjoyed every bit of it.
How many of those did you do? How many of those kits did you make?
I made 2 kits. Took me forever, of course, in 3 languages. And in the kit, you have the films. In one, there was 7 films, 7 film strips, which means 7 sound recorded on a long-playing record. And we covered always first the history of the community. And that would take a certain time. And then things that they were more interested in, whatever they wanted to do. For instance, when I did one with the Lillooet people in Mount Currie, BC, we did one, part 1 and part 2, puberty. It's beautiful. The person who did the soundtrack, her name was Marie Leo. She was the last woman there to have gone through a traditional training at puberty time. And she told a whole story from the beginning to the end of what happens and how you get your training and who's involved. And it was very interesting. So I said to Marie, you're going to have to draw about this because I'll never find those images you're talking about. She says, I can't draw. I said, of course you can draw. And she came to stay here. And actually, we did a coloring book of these images. It looks like a child's drawing. And she described everything from the first time she menstruated and what it did and all the training. And it's just so beautiful.
Is there a place we can see the kits now?
You can see them on nfb.ca. You mention my name, you get a good seat to mention my name. And you just, because the film board later on, years after, produced a DVD of all what was in the educational kits as films. So you can actually look at them now like a film. And it's to just say the name Lillooet or Manoan, which is the 2 communities I went to. And in the box of this, there was 7 or 6 films. The long playing record, which had all the sound. Sometimes there was 2 long playing records. And then there were toys made by the children in the kit. There were maps. There were old photographs that I would pick in the archives and with the information in the back in 3 languages. Games of dolls, some of them, one in Lillooet, it was made by the children themselves. And a miniature pair of snowshoes, also done by the children. And from Lillooet, also a rug on the floor made out of, from a tree. But all kinds of things that children could touch and pass it around and discuss. That was a plus in the educational kit. Wow. And in this case of Lillooet, there was a coloring book and many things that for a teacher, it was a lot of tools, and especially on One Nation to talk about them and their games and gambling games and how they made canoes, how they, what has to do with their culture and a live culture, the language. So it was fascinating, to work on that.
Well, that's amazing, and obviously a pretty bold innovation that really, I think, very likely for the first time in Canada, started presenting the stories of the people from the perspective of themselves. From you as a storyteller, bringing their stories to life in the classroom.
Such a wonderful experience.
Que ça en souida Wambanaki Odana Kinisi Tali Kasi on Kisi Tali Peka on Madim miwi di Madim miwi di Hodahina namka ko on le migadek.
Friends, that brings us to the end of part one of our conversation with the 13th laureate of the Glenn Gould Prize, Alanis Obomsawin. And I really found it inspiring to hear of her resilience and the courage that she has shown throughout her early life, the experiences that formed her as a person and an artist, and that really prepared her to be the remarkable witness and example that she's been to generations of Indigenous people across Canada. Olivia, what did you take from the conversation?
Well, I think resilient is absolutely the right word. It's pretty remarkable to hear the first-hand account of some of these really heartbreaking stories and tragedies, which unfortunately and terribly get glossed over in much of Canadian history. So Alanis, her work, her storytelling, these are necessary conversations to have. And I feel very privileged to be able to work with Alanis one-on-one and with you, Brian.
And friends, we are so excited to share with you information about the events that we have coming up as Alanis Obomsawin receives her $100,000 Glenn Gould Prize. We will be unveiling the premiere of Seeds, The Art of Alanis Obomsawin, a spectacular sound and light show, which will be presented from October 4th to 18th on the massive east face of the Royal Ontario Museum. No admission, just come after dark and you'll be able to see it. It's a brilliant presentation of Alanis's visual art brought to life with the visionary animations of Métis artist Terrell Calder. Of course, we will be presenting the Glenn Gould Protégé Prize to Victoria Anderson Gardner. And in addition, we have other events coming up. The trailer for Seeds will be presented at this year's Toronto International Film Festival. So you'll be able to find out more about this innovative program on the evening that they are paying tribute to Alanis, September 14th. And Victoria, what more do we have coming up?
Well, we are working on something very exciting in partnership with Percival Press and one of our directors on our board, Viggo Mortensen. We are producing a beautiful hardcover art book called Dream Visions, and it is celebrating the visual art of Alanis. And we have many friends and supporters involved in this book writing appreciations, including Laurie Anderson and Richard Reed Perry, who were on the Glenn Gould Prize jury, who chose Alanis as the 13th laureate, as well as a preface from Buffy St. Marie, a long 6,000-word interview with Alanis. It's really a beautiful piece of work. So you will hear more details very soon about where and when that is available, but it will be available widely, so please stay tuned.
And thank you again, friends, for helping us celebrate this extraordinary artist. And we hope you'll join us for part 2 of our conversation with the amazing Alanis Obomsawin. And before we go, Olivia, do you have some additional information to share with our friends?
Oh, yes. You can hear about all of these updates on our social media at the Glenn Gould Foundation, and of course on our website, glenngould.ca. We are a registered Canadian charity, and if you are interested in this work and you care to support it, please consider donating. We really appreciate every little bit.
Thank you again, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks, folks. Stay tuned.
Waldam, Waldam, Anakwika, Ktodana, Waldam, Waldam, Malian Pita Odana Anakwika Santi Waldam Ndatama We